Hello friends and welcome back to the Bodo Show. I am next to a monolith, a menhir, oh no, menhir is over there. This is a dolmen from Abkhazia, from Georgian region of Abkhazia, which is Bronze Age, maybe even Neolithic, old, ancient burial site. I used to think it was a home where people used to live, but apparently this is a burial where ancient tribal kings from the mountains of Caucasus were entombed, and later, thousands and thousands of years later, now it is in Georgian Ethnological Museum, where I am at right now. Hello friends, sorry for interrupting my own video. Unfortunately, some technical difficulties came about and I had to re-record the prelude, and prelude became so complicated I made it into a separate video. In previous video I talked about historical origins of a lot of mythology. Topic became so complicated I had to separate it into a separate video where I talk about mythological origins of a lot of fantasy creatures and how those mythologies originate from a lot of ancient burial rituals and old buildings and such that I visit, where a lot of races that were familiar from fantasy come from mythology, but those mythological creatures such as elves, dwarves, giants, and such have older human burial ritual origins, and how ancient giants built old monolithic giant stone structures, and how those ancient burials were the homes of old spirits. So if you want to watch that video, please watch it. Here I want to talk about more about fantasy and world building. I'm using my 3,000-year-old Bronze Age spear as a microphone stand here, just to keep the old structure vibe going that I had in my previous video and the video I'm inserting myself into. So the main topic here is about using history and mythology as inspiration for making your own fantasy world and world building. This is one of my favorite things to do, especially as a dungeon master. I create a lot of fantasy worlds that my players, my friends, have to inhabit, but I always go above and beyond what is necessary, and the whole mental space and energy that goes into world building, unfortunately, my players do not get to experience it, but I still have so many crazy ideas. I would like to share it with you, the viewers, especially my idea that we need to use more historical and mythological inspirations in fantasy, because what I don't like in modern fantasy, it's just repeating and regurgitating old used and reused ideas that once came from mythology but has been just watered down. All creativity and culture and ethnic vibes have been all stripped away to create this generic fantasy that I don't like. I like generic fantasy ideas of having collective consciousness idea of what dwarf, elf, orc, and such are, but I feel those races and characters have been slowly stripped off of all their creativity, especially in D&D, which is a whole bag of worms I'll get into in the future. I'll make whole separate videos about that topic. But here I just want to fix that problem that I see, especially in tabletop RPGs, having this generic, almost bland characters meant to be just frameworks for dungeon masters to create new worlds in. But even that framework is so bland and generic, I'd like to infuse my ethnic character into it. And actually, before starting my video channel, which is about history and mythology and fantasy, I actually started making similar projects. I made this, of course, I'm trying to insert this into conversation anytime I have. My TTRPG that I made, Sakveni Sagmironia, heroic heroism or heroic quest, or I need to translate it properly. But this is a book I made as a university finals project, as a Georgian and Caucasian in general, cultural, mythological fantasy book. Basically, I used my knowledge of mythology and history and made a little booklet. Unfortunately, I made it overcomplicated. I worked on it far, far too long just to work out the ideas of it, and I had to finish the book in 3 weeks. This whole book, with its drawings, with its illustrations, with its everything, is completely made in 3 weeks. And that strain and overworking myself and sleepless nights kind of broke me mentally. And unfortunately, for 2 years, I haven't been able to return to actually drawing. It messed me up so much. And I want to use this project to return to world building and TTRPG making and use it as a force myself to start drawing again. I kind of lost my drawing skills a bit, so I need to relearn a lot of things, and I need a reason to do it because I spend a lot of times thinking about world building, how my games, preparing my games, like characters need to meet in a tavern. I'm like, what kind of guild system is there for tavern keepers, and what economy is that? What kind of food would be available in this ecology? What would their menu be like? And of course, none of my players even ask for the menu of the tavern, those bastards. But I still overthink and overcomplicate things. But I enjoy this process, and I really want to share it with you because before making this book, few years before then, about 4 to 3 years ago, I actually made a even smaller booklet where I was supposed to do exactly this topic, make a anthropological cultural look at fantasy races such as dwarves, elves, orcs, giants, blah blah blah. But of course, me with my terrible planning and horrible procrastination, I had to finish it in 3 days. And in those 3 sleepless days, I made a silly little book about dwarves and their culture, which is completely unfinished and terribly written because I haven't slept in 3 days before finishing, and I wrote the whole text with my eyes closed, half asleep. So you can really tell that I made this in 3 days while also working on another university project. Many, many pre-rambles and rambles. What I want to do here, what I want to do here is take generic fantasy races. Those elves, dwarves, and such are now collective modern world mythology. Fantasy is our modern folklore. This is what I believe in. And it would be more interesting and more fun, for me at least, to re inject actual knowledge that I've gathered from studying my cultures and world culture, mythology, and history, which I feel is very lacking in modern fantasy. By asking the simple question of how those creatures, those races, those beings came about, how they evolved, taking more of an anthropological evolutionary lens to it, and how their culture evolved as well, and how what kind of gods, mythology, and beliefs those fantasy races and creatures have for themselves. Taking the approach of what if all mythology and all fantasy were true at the same time? A lot of fantasy writers do this, but I don't think they quite capture the through line, the thread that actually connects them, which I think is very important. And one of the more important things, more ambitious things that I want to do is actual diversity, which is my pet peeve in modern fantasy. There's a whole hullabaloo about this topic, pushing diversity and inclusion or some other nonsense Western countries love to do, adding people from different backgrounds and different skin tones in generic fantasies, rather than making those fantasy and adventure stories about those underrepresented cultures. As someone from an underrepresented culture, I'm really, really upset when I see this. Rather than actually give voices to underrepresented cultures, to let them tell their own stories, what I'm trying to do on my channel, they would rather just take people from different backgrounds and shove them into their 50th reproduction and remake of King Arthur or Robin Hood stories. King Arthur, Robin Hood, Robin Hood, King Arthur. And oh, how creative in this 56 adaptation of Robin Hood, we put an Asian character in there. Do introduce his culture, what type of an Asian is he Chinese, Japanese, what cultural insights will he bring? No. Just someone with a different skin tone. Same generic story, but with different skin tones, which is really bothers me. I am a lover of world culture and world mythology and world history. I try to learn, especially about underrepresented cultures, and I feel there is such a deep well that you can take for inspirations and actually straight up adapt those mythologies and those stories. But none of those Hollywood bigwigs would ever want to do it. Just grab a person with a different skin tone and the revolution has begun. I don't know, this is a whole hullabaloo on the internet that I don't want to get into because it's a really toxic topic. But I hopefully, I don't know, I could try to maybe at least put my cultural spin and my culture, as I probably you've seen my dwarven mythology video where I talk about how dwarves are like just Caucasians. I want to follow that line that I would use my knowledge of Caucasian culture, Eastern European, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern cultures, and reinfuse that vibes and that ideas, and that's basically what I want to do, and give my creative ideas, and hopefully you, dear viewers, would also enjoy and chime in, tell me your ideas. I'll put shameless plug, I'll put my book images and my previous dwarf anthropology book pages on my Patreon, and I'll put later when I get deeper and deeper into this topic, I'll put polls up on my world building project on my Patreon. You can join it for free if you want to, just to give a vote, or if you help out to make this happen, that would be great. Because the reason I started my channel talking about history, talking about mythology, especially going to armor's history and the weapons and stuff like that, because I feel like modern fantasy and modern movies in general about history, with fantasy, bit whatever, really lacks general understanding or even curiosity about anything to do non-American, non-Western culture. I'm from the southeastern edge of Europe. Some even don't consider my culture and my country part of Europe, but I consider myself as Georgia, the country I come from, as part of the old world, be it Roman and Greek influences and Persian influences, and even beyond Hittite influences. And basically, Georgia has been throughout all this history, and me learning my own country's history is me learning the world history from beginning to end. I think this Schrodinger's European status, that I'm both considered Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, European, Asian, whatever, this kind of gives me the ability to dodge any allegations in the future that, oh, you're the white, the European. No, I'm Middle Eastern. And someone's like, you're a Middle Eastern. No, I'm European. So if you like what I want to do here, I'll continue, of course, making my history and mythology videos. I'll try to make it so that I first make history and mythology videos, and then using those ideas I presented before, we'll make some fantasy topic about it. Or if I just talk about fantasy topic, I'll try to introduce more historical and mythological and folklore and cultural elements to it. So if you'd like to follow along, and if you're able to withstand my endless ramblings, please follow along, please subscribe to my channel, and please watch my previous video, especially about history, which I need to get back into. So history, mythology, fantasy, this is the content I'm going with, and I'll go more in depth into world building, especially about our favorite elves, dwarves, and giants. All right, now let's get back to me in the past, in the mountains, visiting ancient ruins. this is what I love to do. I think about this all the time, taking historical inspirations, combining it with mythological inspirations, then mixing it with modern pop culture and trying to give a modern explanation. Like for what I said, that why do we have little gnome statues in our garden? Because in the ancient world where gnomes were still alive, they used to build those little structures, little monuments to their ancestors, to their family members, as they become spiritual links to them in the material world. And they have, when the gnome passes away, for example, they create their little stone guy, and they can use that stone guy to communicate with their ancient ancestors. So similarly, for example, dwarves make giant monoliths and monuments and menhirs and different structures to honor their ancestors and create a link and spiritual link that connects them to their hello bumblebee, spiritual link, like a radar, like a living link that the dwarven druids and priests can use to connect to their ancestors. That dwarves take on their spirit remains in nature, in environment, and they create a connection using those structures. In later videos, I'll try to delve deeper into like ancient Stone Age made up history of dwarves and elves and gnomes and halflings, how they evolved, how they separated from one another, how they become different species, how they develop their natural and spiritual connections. For example, if I get your interest, I'm gonna give you my ideas beforehand, like fey folks such as elves, goblins, satyr and other fey adjacent folk, and earth folk such as dwarves, halflings, gnomes and other earth spirits, separated in different environments. The earth folk lived in the mountains and before the world that we know formed in mythological age, and the elves lived in the giant god trees. So the fae who lived on top of the tree and in the brushes and leaves where it was much safer became elves, and they didn't have to worry about predators and other creatures hunting them as much, so they developed higher culture. They learned more magic, trying to connect through reincarnation cycles. But goblins who lived in the roots and in the underneath the tree root system, they had to constantly battle between other creatures and other monsters and other beings who were trying to kill them. So they had more survival mentality, so they became more oriented around survival, passing down their genes. They live much shorter lives but have more children, while the elves live much longer lives and reproduce far infrequently. But in dwarven culture, I imagine a stout folk, I'll call them collectively a stout folk, where dwarves are connected to metalworking and mines. Gnomes are connected to gems and precious minerals and chemicals that can be found in earth. And halflings are connected to, like for example, Damavoy, more homely nature, but like cultivation of nature, farmland, and the earth's ability to provide. So their culture venerates different aspects of the earth. Dwarves venerate earth as the primary elements, stone, iron, and maybe the druidic culture is more connected to wind, storm, lightning, and the cultivation of that elemental forces and bending the elements to their will, and see nature as nothing other than something that can provide for them and be useful to them. They see everything in how useful it is for me and my survival, because mountains are of course really harsh, and so their mentality was more oriented towards survival and toughing it out and passing down their knowledge and their customs to their generations. So there's communal structure is built around family and survival of the family rather than individual. And then going into, for example, halflings, they are more connected to nature, they're more spiritually connected to, and they build more wooden structures, using still that dwarven mentality of bending nature to your will, but more as you're its shepherd, you are a guide of nature. You need to bend it to your will, but through love and dedication, rather than break it with buzz and cutting down wood and throwing them in the furnace and seeing tree as nothing more than material. They see tree as their spiritual connection. Again, I believe halflings are more of a mix of elves and dwarves, so they have more connection to nature through the elven fey heritage, and more materialistic mentality through the agricultural bending of nature. Gnomes are more combining elven high society and high research and study of the natural forces, and bending magic to their will, and combining their knowledge to the nature, like they magically dominate life itself, but taking that mentality but applying to the material world, such as chemicals, crystals, magical crystals, how to utilize them, alchemy, how to use chemicals provided from the earth, and how to use metals, different properties. And they're more scientifically minded but still use magic, but some of them are more druidic and connected to nature. Some of them don't even care about nature and just want to use it for their alchemical purposes. I constantly think about it to create more complex societies where I can later tell stories about, oh, I need a halfling character. Oh, this halfling character, I already have a picture of what kind of life would they lead, what is their values, what societies, what kind of parents did they have, what is positive traits of their societies, what is negative traits of their societies. This is another point I like to build on. I don't like good societies, bad societies. Every society has good and bad qualities. Some societies are fully fallen into the darkness. Unfortunately, there are many real-world societies who have fully fallen into the darkness, but there are more positive societies who try to emulate more noble parts of their culture. Let's take dwarves, for example, again, my favorite race. Dwarves might be, their noble trait might be their love of family, their respect for their elders, respect for their ancients, respecting old customs. But it can be a negative trait. It can be that older folk do not let younger folk air their minds, don't let them thrive. It's all about respecting the elders and not about innovating. That could be a negative trait you can promote in, the dwarf might not fit into his society because he has more modern ideas and doesn't like listening to his elders, which is really bad trait to have as a dwarf. So he's kicked out of society. And you can, for example, they're far more religious, so they're not welcoming from arcane magic or druidic magic, and are not as welcoming to new ideas. You can play around with it. I really like the Underdark to have like a darker version of a society, and Overland has more complex, more noble, aspirational society, but Underdark has a darker, twisted version of this society. For example, dwarves do not like magic and do not like participating in with other cultures, so Duergar, the underworld dwarves, are far more xenophobic, far more like refuse even worshipping gods, and are more like brutalist Soviet style Duraks. I call them Durs and Duraks. And are more inspired by Soviet history of Georgia. When I think about Duergar and Duraks, who are anti-religion, anti-science, and anti-magic. And for example, elves have their own like, elven culture is the best. And what is the most radical version of that? Of course, the drow, who are feminazis, combination of World War II stinky Germans and elves, because elves come from Germanic society. So I will like that, combining those like negative traits and positive traits that I find from Germanic, from not just Germanic. I like using
different inspiration from Celtic, from proto like hunter gatherers, and different influences. But this is the area I imagine them to inhabit, fantasy version of Europe and Asia, and that is the inspiration I get. I'll dive deep into their cultures, how they evolved. I want to go really in proto dwarves before like I have like really complex ideas that there was a time before giants and dwarves were one same race, like proto-brute, who then splintered off, dwarves that delve into mountains, and giants who later evolved into more steppelands, and they're more nomadic, and their whole cultural influences that once upon a time there were cousins who take care of each other, but against battling against dragons, previous oppressors. But when they destroyed dragons, giants became the oppressors of dwarves, and then dwarves rebelled against giants, and now they have really antagonistic relationship, which I, of course, take a lot of inspiration from Caucasian mythology about heroes fighting giants. And there are a lot of mythology, of course, surrounding dragons. Over there is a menhir, which is a dragon stone that people used to sacrifice for good harvest. Especially dragons were associated with water and spirits. So serpent dragons, Gueleshapi, are river spirits, and Vishapi themselves are lake water spirits. And ancient humans used to pray to them, sacrifice even virgins, according to some Christians who didn't like them accounts. I really want to take that history and flesh it out in more fantasy version of how halflings, for example, were enslaved by dragons. So halflings used to sacrifice half of the food production to the dragons, but one day the giants came, saved them from dragons. Giants are the natural enemy of the dragons, but then they said, we didn't save you, you just are under new management. Halfling, half giants, then the brutes that were born, I consider them Devgmiri or Bagatir, who later rebelled against the giant oppressors and used their giant heritage and their strength to kick them out and create their own state, inspired by Kievan Rus. And then goblins and the orcs invade from the east. I'm gonna go into that later on, but here I just wanted to showcase how I like to use real world history and real world mythology to influence my thinking of storytelling, world building. But world building isn't just a separate thing, because when you're telling a story that is set in a world. Best worlds, I think, best stories have a living, thriving world that you as a reader would like to inhabit. Screw the main characters, I just love to live in that world. For example, my favorite world isn't Tolkien. I really love Tolkien, but my favorite world is Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I take most of inspiration from him, where Discworld itself is the main character, and you can tell stories in the Ankh-Morpork, this little city over there. It's not a little, giant city-state. You can tell stories about wizards who live in that city. You can tell stories about ramped-up mountains and witches who inhabit those mountains. You can set your story in any place. You get the feeling that every part of this world has a fun adventure going on. You just need to walk into that part of the world and you will be swept into a crazy world. For example, Rinsu and that poor guy, constantly, every time he goes somewhere, he gets enthralled in someone else's adventure. He desperately tries to escape, but every part of the world has some cool, interesting adventure just for him waiting. And I just want to give that feeling that I took time, I took inspiration from history, from mythology, from pop culture, that my players, and hopefully in the future you, dear viewer, as well, can take inspiration or would like to inhabit your creative imagination, to be like, I would like to go into that world, I would like to visit that city. It's so complex, it's so interesting. The creator took so much effort in building out the lore, the world, the buildings itself tell stories like this. Again, going back to the monolithic structure that I'm sitting on, I don't know if you guys really understand how cool of a thing this is. This was built thousands and thousands of years ago. We don't fully understand how it was built, probably by pulleys and levers and a lot of strong folks pushing and hollering, but it's still really interesting to think. Maybe the legends about giants and dwarves, the Devi and Juja, are real. So think about that. Use your nature, your history, your culture, from other cultures, as inspiration to tell new stories, to share, to create connection, to create a world that is worth living in. I also want to in my video showcase that our world is such world that it is important to appreciate and be happy that you live in it. I'm currently buzzing with joy, the fact that I can touch something that my ancestors, my great forefathers took their time and effort to build. I'm sorry I've been rambling on without end for a really long while, so I just want to thank you guys, everyone, for watching my video. Please watch more, put it in the background at least, and appreciate your history and appreciate other people's culture as well. This is what I'm trying to promote here. Love of culture, love of history, and love of fantasy. Thanks and take care. Bye-bye.